Vivian Blackwood needed a husband in 48 hours. Nolan Hayes needed enough money to save his daughter's last home. The deal seemed simple enough. Wear a ring, smile through a weekend with a billionaire family, then vanish on Monday morning. But on the first night inside the Blackwood estate, her father began asking questions no one had prepared for. Nolan noticed someone had been quietly rewriting the family's inheritance documents, and Vivian realized the man she had hired understood her family better than any advisor ever had. By Sunday morning, an old will lay torn on the study floor. Secrets that had been buried for years finally surfaced in front of the entire family, and nothing about that family would ever look the same again. If you have ever wondered how one hired husband could unravel an entire empire built on secrets, stay until the end, because the truth this family buried came back for all of them. Vivian Blackwood was in the middle of a board call when her father's number lit up her phone, and she knew before she answered that whatever came next would not be good news. Gideon Blackwood rarely called during business hours unless he wanted something immediate, and this time what he wanted was her husband, standing in the entrance hall of Ashbourne by Friday afternoon. She had told him months earlier, in a moment of desperation during a holiday dinner, that she had secretly married, mostly to stop him from pushing her toward reconciliation with Julian Carrington and the merger of two old fortunes that reconciliation would guarantee. Gideon announced that every member of the family would gather that weekend to hear his decision about succession and the future of the company's leadership, and if her husband failed to appear, he would assume she had lied to his face and would begin transferring voting control to a trust managed by her cousin instead. Vivian tried explaining that her husband was traveling for work overseas, but Gideon told her a private plane was already waiting, and there was no version of that excuse that would hold for 3 more days. She hung up with less than 72 hours to find a man intelligent enough to be believable, discreet enough to keep her secret, and steady enough not to be rattled by the sheer weight of Blackwood money. She stood at the window of her office for a long moment after the call ended, watching the city stretch out below her in gray afternoon light, and she felt for the first time in years the particular kind of fear that came from knowing a single lie, told in a moment of weakness, could unravel everything she had spent a decade building. The lie had felt harmless when she told it, a small shield against her father's insistence that she reunite with Julian for the sake of 2 banking dynasties merging into one. But lies like that never stayed small. They grew roots, they demanded upkeep. And now the upkeep had a deadline attached to it, one she could not negotiate her way out of no matter how many board meetings she had survived. Julian arrived at her office not long after, wearing the practiced concern he always wore when he sensed an opening, suggesting gently that she could still confess everything, step down from her position, and let him help stabilize the company in her place. Something in the way he said it told Vivian he already knew about the lie before she had told a single soul, and the realization sat cold in her chest long after he left her office. She spent the rest of the afternoon scrolling through years of contacts, executives and consultants and old business school classmates, searching for someone who might convincingly pass as a husband in front of a man who had spent 72 years learning to detect weakness at a glance. None of them fit. Each one carried some trace of ambition that her father would smell within minutes, some hunger for what marrying into the Blackwood name might eventually buy them. She needed someone who wanted nothing from her family, someone who had already looked directly at Blackwood money and refused it once before. And as she stared at the names of every man who had ever worked with her, she realized there was only one person who had never once flinched in her presence, and his name was Nolan Hayes. Nolan's workshop sat on the edge of town, a converted garage full of sawdust and the smell of varnish, where he spent his mornings restoring furniture that other people had given up on. Sunlight came through a row of dusty windows and settled in long strips across the concrete floor, catching the fine dust that drifted every time he ran a hand plane over old oak, and the radio in the corner played low static-laced country music that he never quite bothered to tune properly. It was the kind of place that smelled like patience, like second chances given to things everyone else had discarded, and there was a quiet irony in that which Nolan had never fully let himself examine. He was working on an old table that had once belonged to a Blackwood hotel, shuttered years earlier when Vivian stepped through the door, her tailored coat and polished shoes looking entirely out of place against the dust and clutter of the workshop, and he recognized her instantly, though he made no effort to seem impressed. A framed photograph of his late wife and his daughter, Sadie, sat on a shelf near the register, and Vivian's eyes drifted toward it briefly before she spoke, though neither of them mentioned it yet. He remembered the company well because it was the same one that had buried a safety report he had written 3 years earlier, a report that named more than a dozen violations that never got fixed, a report that ended his career as an inspector and left his name attached to accusations of incompetence he had never deserved. Vivian offered him $50,000 to pretend to be her husband from Friday afternoon until Monday morning, to memorize a fictional love story, wear a wedding ring that meant nothing, and survive a weekend of questions from a family built on suspicion. He said no without hesitation, unwilling to walk back into a world that had already tried to destroy him once. She raised the offer to $75,000, and still he refused, right up until his bank called that same afternoon to warn him that his mortgage was heading toward foreclosure if he could not make a payment within the week. Even with his home on the line, Nolan did not accept immediately. Instead, he set his own condition, telling Vivian that Blackwood Global would pay every outstanding invoice owed to the 14 contractors who had worked on that same shuttered hotel, men and women who lost income because his warnings had been ignored. Vivian studied him for a long moment, understanding for the first time that this man was not using the opportunity to enrich himself, and something about that honesty unsettled her more than any negotiation she had conducted in years. She was used to people asking for more the instant they sensed she had a need, used to watching greed flicker behind polite smiles the moment a number was named, and Nolan's refusal to take advantage of her desperation left her oddly off balance, the way a person feels when a familiar staircase turns out to have one step fewer than expected. She agreed to his terms on the spot, calling her lawyer from the doorway of the workshop to arrange payment to the contractors before she had even finished shaking his hand. Before he left the workshop that first evening, Vivian asked one more question, almost against her own better judgment, wanting to know why a man in his position, with a home on the line and a daughter to raise alone, had not simply taken the money and walked away without setting any conditions at all. Nolan considered the question for a long moment before answering that money without conscience had already cost him everything once, and he was not interested in trading one kind of ruin for another, however comfortable the second version might look on paper. But Nolan warned her, quietly and without any theater, that he would play the part of her husband, not the part of a man without principles, and that distinctions, he told her, would matter before the weekend was over. Vivian brought him to her penthouse the following evening, a glass and steel apartment high above the city that felt more like a hotel suite than a home, sparse and immaculate in a way that told Nolan she rarely spent much time there at all. Her lawyer had already drafted a strict confidentiality agreement specifying separate bedrooms and forbidding either of them from allowing the fiction to enter any legal document, and Nolan read every line twice before signing, the same careful habit that had once made him a thorough inspector. Together they built the story that would carry them through the weekend, claiming they had met during the renovation of a hotel property, dated quietly for a year, and married in a small ceremony along the coast where no one from either family had been invited, a detail Vivienne insisted upon so that no one could easily verify or disprove the specifics. Nolan quickly realized that Vivienne could recite quarterly earnings from memory, but had no idea what a husband was supposed to know. The small things, how he took his coffee, which foods he could not stand, what time he woke each morning, details that seemed trivial until the moment someone across a dinner table asked about them and expected an answer without hesitation. He made her learn those details properly, quizzing her the way a teacher might quiz a stubborn student, and she found herself surprised by how much effort it took to memorize the invented rhythms of an ordinary life, the kind of small domestic facts she had never needed to know about anyone before, let alone pretend to know about herself. In exchange, over tea that had gone cold on the table between them, she told him things she rarely said aloud, that her mother had died when she was young, quietly and without warning, in a hospital room Vivienne still remembered down to the color of the curtains, and that her father had turned his grief into an empire and his daughter into its heir apparent, as though building something enormous enough might eventually fill the space her mother had left behind. While they tried on rings for the first time, turning small silver bands over in their hands under the soft light of the penthouse kitchen, Nolan's phone rang with a short call from his daughter, wanting to know when he would be home and whether he had remembered to feed the dog before he left. Vivienne listened from across the room as his voice softened entirely, the confidence of the negotiation replaced by something warmer and unguarded, patient in a way she had never once heard a man speak to anyone in her presence. It was the first time she had seen a man capable of being both immovable and tender without performing either quality for an audience. Before they parted for the night, Nolan asked her the real reason she had lied to her father in the first place, and Vivienne admitted quietly that she wanted just one decision in her life that Gideon Blackwood had not orchestrated for her. Later that evening, while reviewing old company records out of habit, Nolan discovered that Julian Carrington had personally signed off on the very project where his safety report had disappeared. The man waiting for Vivienne to fail was the same man who had once destroyed Nolan's career, and neither of them yet understood how deeply that history was about to matter. Nolan lay awake a long while after that discovery, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling of the guest room, turning the coincidence over in his mind, wondering whether fate or something more deliberate had placed him back in the orbit of the very man who had cost him everything. He decided, before sleep finally came, that he would say nothing until he understood the full shape of what was happening inside that house. The estate called Ashbourne sat behind iron gates, surrounded by vineyards and dense woodland that made it feel less like a family home and more like the seat of an empire. Gravel crunched beneath the tires of the car as it wound up the long drive, past rows of grapevines heavy with late-season fruit, and a stone fountain that had not been shut off in decades, and Nolan felt the weight of the place settle over him the moment the house came into view, all pale stone and towering windows that seemed designed less for comfort than for intimidation. He had restored furniture from homes like this before, had spent enough hours inside grand old rooms to know that houses built to impress were rarely built to be lived in honestly. Nolan and Vivienne were required to hold hands as they walked through the entrance, and in front of Gideon, Julian, her cousin Cyrus, and a wide circle of extended relatives, Vivienne introduced Nolan as her husband for the first time out loud. Gideon did not ask a single question about the wedding itself. Instead, he looked directly at Nolan and asked what the first thing was that had disappointed him about his daughter. Vivienne feared the question would break the entire arrangement in seconds, but Nolan answered calmly that Vivienne often confused controlling a situation with actually understanding it. The room fell silent for a beat before Gideon laughed. a short and genuine sound that no one else in the family seemed accustomed to hearing, while Julian began studying Nolan with the wary attention of a man recalculating a threat. During afternoon tea, Nolan noticed the household staff avoiding Cyrus whenever possible, and when an older estate manager accidentally dropped a folder of maintenance records, Cyrus snatched it up so quickly that the movement itself seemed suspicious. In the brief moment before the folder disappeared, Nolan caught sight of a logo he recognized immediately, the same hotel property where his old report had vanished, and his pulse quickened in a way he did not let show on his face. He said nothing at the time, only reached for another cup of tea and let his eyes drift back to the garden beyond the terrace, filing the detail away, the same careful way he had once filed away structural inconsistencies in buildings other people assumed were sound. Gideon announced that on Sunday morning, the family's longtime attorney, Margaret Sloane, would formally read the terms of a new will in front of everyone gathered. That night, long after the household had gone quiet, Nolan noticed the door to Gideon's study standing open, though the old man had already retired for the evening, and something about the timing told him the house was not as settled as it appeared. At the formal dinner the following evening, Gideon peppered the table with careful questions designed to test the marriage from every angle. Vivian answered each one with the precision of someone reciting memorized facts, but the more accurate her answers became, the less natural the whole story sounded. When Gideon asked how they had first met, Nolan abandoned the rehearsed version entirely, telling the table instead that the first time he and Vivian truly faced each other, she had offered him money to stay silent about a company matter, and he had refused. Vivian was furious that he had strayed so far from the script, but Gideon seemed delighted to learn that his daughter had encountered a man who could not be bought. Julian tried to embarrass Nolan by asking pointed questions about his education, his career, and his finances, and Nolan answered honestly that he ran a small workshop and was at that very moment at risk of losing his own home. He turned the question back on Julian, asking whether wealth made a person more trustworthy or simply better at hiding their mistakes for longer. Silverware stopped clinking against china, and for a moment the only sound in the room was the low crackle of the fireplace at the far end of the hall. Even the household staff seemed to move more carefully as they cleared plates, sensing that something in the balance of the evening had shifted. The table grew visibly tense, and after dinner, Gideon pulled his daughter aside near the tall windows overlooking the dark vineyard, his voice low enough that only she could hear it, to tell her that Nolan was nothing like the kind of man she usually chose. Vivian replied that perhaps that was exactly why she had chosen him, a line she had meant only to protect the fiction, though it left her strangely unsettled once she said it aloud. Back in her room that night, she discovered a small torn scrap of paper tucked inside Nolan's false wedding band, bearing a code number that matched the hidden maintenance file Cyrus had been so eager to hide. Nolan explained that the code matched a project number from the safety report he had written years earlier, and that the numbers on the maintenance file suggested repair funds had been formally approved even though the actual construction work had never completed. That meant someone had quietly pulled money out of Blackwood Global and disguised the theft behind a set of falsified maintenance records. Vivian's first instinct was to suspect Nolan of using the weekend as an act of personal revenge, but he handed her a copy of the old report and asked her to check the approval signature herself. Under the pretense of wanting to see old photographs of her parents' wedding, they made their way to the estate's private archive, a narrow room lined with filing cabinets and cedar shelving that smelled of old paper and dust. Nolan moved through the folders methodically, the same way he once combed through inspection files, while Vivian held a small flashlight steady over his shoulder, her breath quiet in the dim room. It did not take long before he found several contracts bearing Vivienne's digital signature, dated on days when company travel records confirmed she had been overseas on business, thousands of miles from any desk that could have produced them. Vivienne understood then that Julian and Cyrus were not simply skimming money from the company. They were quietly constructing a paper trail of failures under her name, engineering the appearance of incompetence to justify removing her from power entirely. In the glass conservatory later that night, Vivienne admitted for the first time that she had spent years trying to become the kind of leader her father would finally respect, so consumed by that effort that she had failed to notice the people closest to her exploiting the isolation it created. Nolan told her that her real weakness was not coldness, but her habit of treating the truth as something that could always be negotiated later. The glass around them held the faint warmth of the day even as night settled outside, and the scent of jasmine from a nearby planter hung heavy in the still air. For one unguarded moment, the two of them drew close in the dim light of the conservatory, closer than the arrangement required, closer than either of them had planned. But Nolan pulled back before it could become anything more, unwilling to let one more lie slip into an arrangement that already had too many. Outside the glass doors, Julian had been standing long enough to understand exactly what they had been discussing. On Saturday morning, mist still clinging low over the vineyard rows, Gideon led the family on a walking tour of the surrounding property, cane in hand though he rarely seemed to need it, pointing out sections of land his own father had purchased decades earlier. He used the occasion to announce his plan to transfer part of the company's ownership into a family trust, watching each relative's reaction carefully as he spoke, the way a man watches for a crack in a foundation he already suspects is failing. Cyrus steered the conversation toward Vivienne's supposed failures, producing reports that claimed her decisions had cost the company millions, through a series of botched Renifkomsprojekts, each document bearing her signature. Nolan quickly noticed that the dates on the paperwork did not align with the actual timeline of equipment production, proof that one report had been signed before the very machinery it referenced had even been manufactured. Vivienne wanted to confront Julian immediately, but Nolan urged patience, warning that they needed the original documents secured before he had any chance to destroy the evidence. That night, once the last of the household lights had gone dark and the halls had settled into the particular silence old houses carry after midnight, they returned to the study on bare feet, careful of every creaking floorboard. Inside an improperly locked file cabinet, tucked behind a stack of unrelated correspondence, they found an unsigned draft of a new will. According to its language, if Gideon ever concluded that Vivienne had lied to the family or lacked the capacity to lead, her voting power would transfer to a trust controlled by Cyrus, while Julian would be installed as executive advisor over the entire company. Nolan pointed out that the formatting and legal phrasing did not match anything Margaret Sloane would have drafted, suggesting the document had been forged from an earlier template. Before either of them could photograph the remaining pages, the overhead lights snapped on without warning, flooding the study in a harsh white glare that made both of them freeze in place like children, caught somewhere they were never meant to be. Gideon Blackwood stood in the doorway in a dark robe, his expression unreadable, demanding to know why his daughter and her husband were going through his private will in the middle of the night. Vivienne opened her mouth to confess everything on the spot, but Nolan spoke first, telling Gideon that he alone had suspected the documents had been tampered with and had taken it upon himself to investigate. Gideon did not raise his voice. He simply asked to speak with Nolan alone the following morning. In the quiet of the estate library, shelves rising 2 stories high around them and the smell of old leather bindings thick in the air, Gideon poured 2 glasses of something amber-colored that Nolan did not touch. The old man slid a check across the desk for $500,000, offering it in exchange for Nolan leaving Ashbourne immediately and signing a statement claiming Vivienne had hired him purely to manipulate the inheritance decision in her favor. Nolan pushed the check back across the table, telling the old man he would answer honestly if ever asked directly, but he would not accept money to turn the truth into a weapon against her. Gideon then revealed something that stunned Nolan completely, that he had known the marriage was fabricated from the very moment Nolan walked through the front door, having found no record of any marriage license on file anywhere. He admitted he had allowed the charade to continue because he wanted to see whether his daughter would fight to protect her position at any cost, or whether she might finally find the courage to tell him the truth on her own. Nolan told him plainly that testing his daughter this way was not so different from the way he had spent her entire life treating her as a project rather than as family, and the observation left Gideon uncharacteristically quiet. Before the conversation ended, Gideon asked whether Nolan was prepared to reveal the full truth, even if it meant Vivienne lost everything she had built. Nolan answered without hesitation, telling him that if Vivienne did not confess on her own before Sunday morning, he would tell the truth himself. When Nolan relayed the ultimatum to Vivienne, they stood on the balcony outside her guest room, the vineyard stretching dark and endless below them, and her voice cracked with something closer to fear than anger. She felt betrayed, insisting that he could not possibly understand what it had cost her to earn even a fraction of recognition inside her own family, that every year of her life had been measured against a standard she never chose and could never quite meet. Nolan answered that he understood exactly what it felt like to have a career destroyed by someone else's lie, but he could not help her win by building yet another one. The argument gradually softened into something more honest, and Vivienne finally admitted that her deepest fear was not losing the company at all, but confirming, once and for all, that her father had always seen her as a disappointment, the same fear that had followed her since childhood. Nolan told her that after his wife passed away, he had hidden the family's financial troubles from his own daughter, believing he was protecting her, only to watch her grow to feel that her father simply did not trust her with the truth. He helped Vivienne see that protecting someone you love does not mean withholding reality from them, no matter how painful that reality might be. By the end of the night, they had agreed that on Sunday morning, Vivienne would confess everything herself before the will was formally read, and immediately after, they would present the evidence of the falsified maintenance records. When they returned to the study to retrieve the forged draft one final time, they discovered the documents had vanished entirely from the cabinet. Moments later, Julian sent Vivienne a message warning that if she did not resign before the morning gathering, he would expose the fake marriage publicly and accuse Nolan of breaking into the study to steal confidential company files. In the middle of that panic, Nolan remembered one crucial detail, that the scanning machine in the library automatically logged a digital timestamp every time a document passed through it, storing the record on the estate's private server. Nolan spent an hour hunched over the estate's aging server terminal, cross-referencing timestamps against the household's private network logs, while Vivienne kept watch by the door, her nerves fraying with every distant creak of the house settling around them. The recovered log revealed something neither of them expected, that the person who had copied and altered the forged will was not Julian at all, but Cyrus Blackwood, working quietly behind the scenes the entire time, using credentials no one had thought to question because no one had ever suspected the quiet cousin who managed spreadsheets and rarely spoke above a murmur at family dinners. Vivienne felt something colder than betrayal settle over her. The particular sting of realizing a threat had been sitting across the table from her for years, disguised as someone too unremarkable to matter. By Sunday morning, Sunlight cutting through tall windows and pooling across the polished floor, the family had gathered in the great room of Ashbourne, seated in a wide semicircle of chairs arranged as though for a trial rather than a reading. Margaret Sloane stood at the front near the fireplace, a plain envelope resting in her hands, ready to open the sealed will that would decide the future of everyone in that room. Before she could begin, Vivian rose to her feet, her hands trembling slightly, though her voice held steady, and confessed openly that Nolan was not her husband at all. She explained, in front of every aunt, uncle, and cousin gathered in that room, that she had hired him out of fear of losing control over both her company and her own life, fear of a father who had never once let her make a mistake without turning it into a lesson about weakness. Cyrus immediately demanded that Gideon strip her of any inheritance for deceiving the family, while Julian produced the forged draft of the will, claiming it had conveniently been discovered inside Nolan's guest room. Nolan did not deny having entered the study, but calmly pointed out the inconsistencies in the dates, signatures, and project codes that proved the document had been altered after the fact. Margaret set down her reading glasses and asked for the laptop containing the server records, and the room waited in near total silence as she scrolled through timestamps and edit histories with the same careful patience she had brought to every legal matter she had handled for this family across 3 decades. She reviewed the scanning log, the digital edit history, and the file's electronic certification, cross-checking each entry against the printed draft in her hands, and confirmed publicly, in a voice that left no room for argument, that the draft had indeed been copied and modified using Cyrus's private credentials on a specific evening earlier that same week. Vivian then presented the falsified maintenance reports and demonstrated how Julian had used her forged signature to funnel company funds toward businesses secretly connected to the Carrington family. Julian stood abruptly, his composure finally cracking at the edges, and attempted to twist the situation, painting Nolan as a bitter outsider who had manipulated his way into a grieving family's home, seeking revenge against the very company that had once ruined him. He raised his voice for the first time all weekend, gesturing toward Nolan as though the accusation alone might be enough to distract the room from the evidence still sitting in Margaret's hands. Nolan admitted openly that he had every reason to resent Blackwood Global, but insisted he had asked for no money and no ownership stake, only that the workers who had gone unpaid for years finally receive what they were owed. Gideon then revealed that he had instructed Margaret to verify the evidence the night before, and that he had personally recorded both the $500,000 offer and Nolan's refusal of it. The room went utterly silent, every relative frozen in place, waiting. Without another word, Gideon picked up the old original will from the table, his hands steady despite his age, and tore it in half in front of every member of his family, the sound of tearing paper louder in that moment than anything spoken all weekend. He announced that the document had been wrong from the very day it was written, because it had handed power to bloodline instead of to responsibility, and that mistake, he said, ended today. Gideon then laid out an entirely new structure for the company's ownership and future leadership. Rather than transferring absolute control to a single heir, he moved 51% of voting power into an independent governance trust designed to outlast any one family member's ambitions, a structure his own lawyers had apparently been drafting in secret for weeks, long before this particular weekend had even been scheduled. Margaret explained the mechanics slowly, so that even the relatives least familiar with corporate structure could understand exactly what had changed and what it meant for every branch of the family sitting in that room. Vivian would serve as chairwoman of that trust, but she would be required to share every major decision with a representative elected by the company's workforce and an independent trustee personally chosen by Margaret Sloane. Cyrus, who had said almost nothing since Margaret's revelation, sat pale and silent near the back of the room, all his usual composure gone. He was removed entirely from the family's asset management office, and every benefit tied to his position was frozen pending a full financial investigation into the missing funds. The quiet cousin, who had spent years operating just outside anyone's suspicion, finally standing exposed in front of the very family he had spent so long quietly undermining. Julian was suspended from the company immediately, escorted from the estate that same afternoon by a member of the household staff who had once fetched his coffee without complaint, and his file was formally handed over to financial investigators. There was no shouting, no dramatic scene in the driveway, only the quiet finality of a man watching every advantage he had spent years accumulating evaporate through paperwork he could no longer control, the consequences arriving through law and procedure rather than through anger or spectacle. Ashbourne itself would no longer belong to a single heir. Gideon decided that after his death, the estate would become a training center and support fund for the very workers the company had spent years quietly overlooking, the vineyards and grand halls repurposed into something that finally served the people who had built the fortune rather than merely those who had inherited it. He said the idea had come to him slowly over the course of the weekend, watching a man with no name on any deed defend a truth that cost him nothing to defend and everything to ignore. Vivian would only inherit her personal share of the family fortune if, within 1 full year, she completed a comprehensive compensation program for every contractor harmed by the company's hidden failures, tracked publicly through quarterly reports that Margaret herself would oversee, and publicly disclosed every project that had ever been buried under a falsified inspection or a conveniently lost file. It was, Gideon admitted, a harder path than simply inheriting everything outright, but he believed she had already proven that weekend that she no longer wanted the easy version of anything. Gideon offered Nolan no money at all, explaining that handing him a fortune would only turn his honesty into something that could be bought after all. Instead, he offered Nolan a position as an independent advisor for a newly created inspection program, one built specifically to catch the kind of failures that had once been buried under his own signature years earlier. The role came with a transparent salary, published where every employee could see it, and the guaranteed right to refuse any instruction that crossed an ethical line, a protection written into the contract itself so that no future executive could ever again bury a report the way his had once been buried. Quietly, later that same afternoon, Gideon found his daughter alone on the terrace overlooking the vineyard and admitted something he had never once said aloud in 72 years of life. The man hired to play her husband for one single weekend had shown him something about his own family that decades of contracts and inheritance planning never had, that they had all been living inside a kind of false marriage to power, polished and profitable and entirely hollow, and none of them had noticed until a stranger with nothing to gain walked through the front door and refused to pretend otherwise. On Monday morning, light spilling gray and quiet through the kitchen windows of the penthouse, Nolan removed the false wedding band and set it gently on the table between them, the small metal circle looking somehow heavier now than it had all weekend. He refused the remaining balance of the agreed payment, keeping only what covered the actual days he had worked. Vivian reminded him that one clause of their arrangement still remained, that he was meant to disappear from her life the moment the weekend officially ended. Nolan asked whether she actually wanted that clause enforced, and for the first time since the entire arrangement began, Vivian did not answer right away, because for once in her life she wanted to make a choice that had nothing to do with fear. Nolan returned home to his daughter Sadie, who met him at the door still in her school clothes, asking a dozen questions about the big house and the fancy family before he had even set down his bag. Within days, his bank confirmed that the outstanding balance on their home had finally been cleared through legitimate wages, and the letter arrived with none of the cold formality of the earlier foreclosure notices, only a simple confirmation that felt, for the first time in years, like solid ground under his feet. The contractors who had waited years for their overdue payments finally began receiving what they were owed as well. Some of them calling Nolan directly just to say thank you, their voices carrying the particular disbelief of people who had stopped expecting to ever be made whole. 6 weeks later, on an ordinary afternoon with sawdust still hanging faintly in the air, Vivian arrived at his workshop alone, without a driver, without a security detail, and without a single piece of paperwork between them, dressed more plainly than Nolan had ever seen her, as though she had deliberately left the armor of her usual life behind at the door. She brought the old false wedding ring with her, though this time she did not ask him to put it back on. Instead, she invited him to dinner, this time with no script to memorize, no audience to perform for, and no pretense of a marriage that had never actually existed. Nolan agreed, on one condition, that whatever came next would begin with nothing but the truth, and Vivienne laughed for the first time in longer than she could remember, a real laugh, unguarded and unpolished, nothing like the careful smiles she had spent years perfecting for boardrooms and cameras. They talked for hours that evening about nothing important, about sawdust and old furniture and a daughter who liked to help sandtable legs on weekends, and neither of them once mentioned Blackwood Global. The story closed months later at the reopening of the old shuttered hotel, its facade freshly restored, brass fixtures gleaming in the afternoon sun, where Nolan now oversaw every safety inspection personally, walking the halls with the same careful attention he had once given to broken chairs and forgotten tables. Vivian stood before a room of former workers, many of whom she now recognized by name, to apologize publicly for years of silence that had cost them more than any of the Blackwoods had ever bothered to calculate. Gideon Blackwood watched quietly from a distance, near the edge of the crowd, leaning on his cane, as his daughter finally became the leader he had always hoped, without ever admitting it aloud, that she could be. The weekend marriage that had never truly existed left behind only one promise that turned out to be real, and it was the only one neither of them had ever bothered to put in writing.